My name is Eleanor Hayes. I never thought a trip meant to bring a family closer could leave me feeling more alone than ever. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. For months, my son Daniel and his wife Claire had been planning this trip abroad. It wasn't just any vacation, it was supposed to be a celebration. Daniel had closed a big deal at work, and Claire's birthday fell during the trip. They told me they wanted to share the experience with me to make it a family event. I was flattered. At 62, I hadn't traveled much outside the country. A trip abroad with them sounded like a gift. Claire handled all the bookings. She liked control, always had. Even before they were married, she was the sort who had to choose the restaurant order, the wine pick, the movie. Daniel seemed fine with it, though. Sometimes I saw the way his eyes glazed over when she started giving instructions. I told myself she just liked things done right, even if her version of right often meant her way. The morning of our flight, I was as excited as a schoolgirl. My suitcase was neatly packed, a modest set of clothes, comfortable shoes for sightseeing, and one nice dress for a special dinner. I imagined us taking photos together in front of grand landmarks, eating local food, laughing in the streets of a foreign city. When we landed, the airport was bustling with noise and light. Daniel and Claire looked fresh despite the long flight. I felt the dull ache in my back from sitting so long, but my excitement pushed the discomfort away. As we walked toward the taxi stand, Claire began giving the driver instructions in a crisp, confident voice. Daniel smiled at me. "You'll love this city, Mom." His tone was warm, and I felt reassured. But I noticed Claire didn't give the driver one destination, she gave him two. I brushed it off, as maybe they were picking up tickets somewhere first. The car ride was long, winding through narrow streets lined with colorful buildings, then turning into wider avenues filled with bright storefronts. Finally, the car stopped in front of a building. It was old, the paint peeling, a flickering light bulb hanging above a dented metal door. The driver unloaded my suitcase here. Confused, I looked at Daniel. "Aren't we going to the hotel?" Claire's smile was tight. "This is where you'll be staying, Eleanor. We thought it might be more comfortable for you, more your style." Her words were dipped in honey but left a bitter aftertaste. I stared at the building again. Comfortable wasn't the word I would use. It looked like the kind of place rented by the hour or to students trying to stretch their last coin. I waited for Daniel to say something, to laugh and say it was a joke, but he only avoided my eyes. "Claire found this place online," he muttered. "Said it would be cozy and closer to the local markets." I felt my throat tighten. Closer to the markets. More my style. What did that even mean? Claire handed me a key attached to a cracked plastic tag. "We'll be at the Grand Imperial," she said breezily, as if mentioning the weather. "5-star, right in the city center. But don't worry, we'll see you tomorrow for sightseeing." The taxi pulled away, leaving me in front of the building with my suitcase, the air thick with the smell of fried oil and damp stone. I forced my legs to move, dragging my luggage through a narrow hallway dimly lit by a single bulb. The room was small, barely enough space for the bed, which sagged in the middle. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, curling like dried leaves. A single window looked out onto an alleyway, where two stray cats were fighting over scraps. I sat on the bed and let the suitcase rest at my feet. The springs creaked under my weight. For a moment, I felt like I'd been tricked into playing a part in some cruel play. They were in a place with polished floors and champagne service, and I was here, in a room that smelled faintly of mildew and something I couldn't quite place, perhaps years of neglect. That first evening, I wandered down the street, bought a small bread roll from a bakery, and ate it alone in my room. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Hope you're settled. Big day tomorrow." No word from Claire. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant hum of traffic, I realized this trip was not going to be the celebration I'd imagined. It was something else entirely, a test maybe, or a warning. but they didn't know me as well as they thought. I might have been in a rundown room, but I wasn't powerless. Not by a long shot. The next morning, sunlight crept through the thin curtains, turning the dusty air golden. I woke early more out of habit than rest. My back ached from the lumpy mattress, and the chill in the air seeped through the worn blanket. The room's tiny radiator had clanked all night, but gave off barely enough heat to take the edge off. I took a slow shower in a cramped bathroom where the water alternated between scalding and icy. My clothes smelled faintly of the room already, a mixture of dust and something damp, and I hated that. At exactly 9:00 a.m., my phone pinged with a message from Daniel. Meet us at Cafe Belle on Grand Avenue at 10. Claire wants to show you something after breakfast. Grand Avenue. That was in the city center where they were staying. I had no idea how far it was from my room, but I doubted it was close. The landlady, a wiry woman with sharp eyes softened only by her gray hair, noticed me struggling with my coat zipper as I stepped into the hallway. "You're going into town?" she asked in a lilting accent. "Yes, to meet my son and his wife." She nodded slowly. "It's a bit of a walk to the main bus line. If you like, I can show you the shortcut." The shortcut was a maze of uneven cobblestone alleys where laundry hung overhead and scooters darted past so close I could feel the wind off their mirrors. The buildings leaned toward each other like old friends sharing gossip, their paint cracked and their shutters barely holding on. By the time I reached Grand Avenue, my shoes were damp from puddles and my hair had frizzed in the morning mist. The contrast was almost laughable here. The streets were wide and polished, lined with designer boutiques and manicured flower beds. The Grand Imperial Hotel stood at the center like a palace, its gleaming marble facade catching the sunlight. I spotted Daniel and Claire through the cafe's glass front. He was laughing at something she said, his shoulders relaxed. She was dressed in a cream silk blouse and a scarf that looked like it had cost more than my entire suitcase of clothes. When I walked in, Daniel greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, but Claire only smiled briefly before returning to her coffee. "How was your first night?" she asked without looking up. "Fine," I said evenly. "The room has character." She smirked. "See, I knew you'd appreciate something authentic. Hotels are so sterile." Her tone made it clear she wasn't paying me a compliment. I wondered if Daniel noticed, but he was already flagging down the waiter. Over breakfast, they discussed their plans for the day. Claire had booked a private wine tasting tour. I waited for them to invite me along. I'd dressed nicely just in case. But instead, Claire said, "You'll love the open-air market near your place, Eleanor. Very colorful. You can spend the day there." Daniel glanced at me with a hint of apology, but he said nothing. I sipped my coffee, slowly masking the sting in my chest. When we parted, Claire climbed into a sleek black car with Daniel and waved like she was doing me a favor. I stood on the sidewalk until they disappeared, then turned back toward the bus stop. The market near my rented room was indeed colorful stalls piled high with fresh fruit, spices in open baskets, and trinkets made by local artisans. But as I browsed, I couldn't shake the image of them sipping wine in crystal glasses, their laughter echoing in some lush vineyard. Around midday, I stopped at a small stall selling handmade scarves. The vendor, a woman about my age, asked where I was from and who I was traveling with. When I told her, she frowned. "They put you in that building?" she asked, naming my street. "Tourists don't stay there unless they have no choice." I forced a polite laugh. "Apparently, it's more authentic." She shook her head and muttered something in her language that I didn't understand, but I understood the pity in her eyes. That evening, I returned to my room to find a small plate of cookies outside my door. A note in careful handwriting read, "For you, Marta." It was from the landlady. I smiled, realizing she must have sensed my isolation. I sat on the edge of the bed nibbling a cookie and thought about the sharp difference between where I was and where Daniel and Claire were. It wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about what they thought I deserved. I could feel the first stirrings of resolve settling in my chest. They had placed me here to keep me small, quiet, and out of sight. They didn't know it yet, but they'd given me a front row seat to see exactly what kind of people they were becoming. And I was already starting to collect the pieces of a story they wouldn't want told. The third day of the trip began with the same uneasy rhythm, a message from Daniel, a location chosen by Claire, and an itinerary that somehow excluded me without ever openly saying so. This time, the text read, "We're taking a day trip to the coast, just us this time. You should check out the museum near your room. Just us." The words stung. It wasn't as if I'd been begging to be glued to their side. All I'd wanted was to share the experiences they'd promised when they first invited me. Instead, it felt like I'd been slotted into some extended family category, the sort of person you see for an hour over coffee, so you can claim you've spent time together. I made myself a cup of instant coffee in the tiny kitchen down the hall. The landlady, Marta, was already there wearing a faded floral apron and kneading dough on the counter. She gave me a warm smile. "They are out again?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. I nodded. "The coast today. Just the two of them." Marta's lips pressed into a thin line. "They do not treat you like family. My niece's husband, he was like this. Always making the mother feel, how you say, small?" Her words settled heavily on me. I hadn't told her much, but somehow she'd read it all in my eyes and the way I carried myself back and forth from that little room. "I suppose I'll take your advice and go to the museum," I said, trying to keep my tone light. The museum was a short walk away, tucked into an old stone building with ivy climbing its walls. Inside, I wandered past glass cases of artifacts, each labeled in 2 languages. Ancient pottery, faded tapestries, and photographs of the city through the decades. All remnants of lives that had endured, changed, and survived. There was a quiet dignity in those displays. No matter how much time had passed, each object still spoke of the hands that had held it. It struck me that my life too had value, even if my daughter-in-law didn't see it. After lunch at a small cafe, I decided to explore the streets without a map. That's when I stumbled into the heart of the city's theater district, narrow lanes, buzzing with energy, lined with posters of past performances. And there, standing outside a ticket booth, was a man I hadn't seen in over 20 years, Richard Webb. He'd been my colleague when I worked as an administrative assistant in a publishing house before I retired. Back then, he'd been a junior editor, always dashing to meetings with stacks of manuscripts under his arm. Now his hair was silver, but his posture was still upright and confident. "Eleanor," he said, his eyes widening. "I almost didn't recognize you." We exchanged the kind of quick, delighted greetings that only old acquaintances can. Over coffee, I learned that Richard now ran a boutique travel agency, specializing in authentic cultural experiences for high-end clients. "What brings you here?" he asked. "My son and his wife," I said carefully. "We're traveling together." He caught the hesitation in my voice. "And how's that going?" I gave a small, humorless laugh. "Let's just say they're staying at the Grand Imperial, and I'm not." His brows furrowed. "That's a shame. This city has so much to offer, but it's better when shared." We talked for an hour before parting ways, but not before he handed me his business card. "If you need anything, a recommendation, a reservation, call me. No charge. I mean it." Back at my room that evening, I found another plate of Marta's cookies waiting. This time, they came with a small jar of her homemade jam. I ate them slowly, savoring the sweetness, the kindness behind the gesture. I was beginning to realize that the trip didn't have to be defined entirely by Claire's choices. Yes, she'd put me in this rundown room far from her luxury bubble, but I could still carve out moments that were mine, moments she couldn't take credit for or diminish. That night, as rain tapped against the window, I made a decision. I would start documenting everything: the room, the peeling wallpaper, the uneven floor, the broken light fixture in the hallway. And not just the physical details, but the absences, the dinners. I wasn't invited to the tours. I wasn't included in the way Claire's smile tightened whenever I entered the room. I didn't know yet how I would use this collection of truths, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to leave this trip feeling like a ghost in my own family's story. If Claire thought she could tuck me away in a corner, she was about to learn I had a much better view from here than she realized. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the damp chill seeping through the thin blanket. I lay there for a while, listening to the distant sound of traffic waking up and thinking about the message I might receive from Daniel today. When it arrived at 8:15, it was short breakfast at the hotel, 9 a.m. Come if you want. Come if you want. Not, we'd love for you to join us. Not, let's eat together. Just an afterthought, as though I were a neighbor they felt obligated to invite. Still, I went. The walk from my building to the bus stop was becoming familiar, but that didn't make it easier. My shoes picked up grime from the damp cobblestones, and by the time I reached the hotel, I could feel the grit in the seams. The Grand Imperial's lobby was another world-polished marble floors, a chandelier dripping with crystal, the faint scent of orchids in the air. Guests floated past in designer coats and tailored suits, while I stood in my worn wool jacket brushing rain from my sleeves. The hostess led me to the breakfast area. Daniel was already there, scrolling on his phone. Claire sat across from him, leaning back in her chair like a queen surveying her court. She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable. "You found it?" she said. "Good." "I took the bus," I replied. "That must be quaint," she said, and I could hear the delicate venom behind the word. The buffet was laid out in a gleaming row, fresh pastries, smoked salmon fruit carved into intricate shapes. I poured myself coffee and took a plate, careful to choose modestly. Claire, meanwhile, was telling Daniel about the rooftop bar they'd visited the night before. The view was incredible. "Shame you missed it, Eleanor." I swallowed my irritation. "I didn't know you were going." "It was last minute," she said, shrugging. "Besides, I thought you'd be tired in your little place." Little place. She couldn't resist twisting the knife. I focused on my coffee, letting the heat steady me. If I reacted now, it would only give her satisfaction. After breakfast, they talked about their day's plans: a guided architectural tour, lunch at a Michelin-starred restaurant, then shopping in the upscale district. At no point did either of them say, "Join us." Instead, Claire smiled politely at me and said, "There's a flea market a few blocks from your building. You might enjoy that." The implication was clear: stay in your lane. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. On the bus ride back, rain streaked the windows, turning the city into a blur. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard, the colleague I'd run into the day before. "Free for lunch tomorrow, I have an idea." I typed back immediately, "Yes. Where?" When I returned to my room, Marta was in the hallway dusting the banister. She smiled when she saw me. "You didn't eat much breakfast." I laughed softly. "You can tell." She nodded. "People who eat alone eat less, not because they aren't hungry, but because it tastes different." Her words were simple, but they landed like a truth I hadn't been willing to say out loud. I was hungry not just for food, but for conversation, warmth, inclusion. The absence of those things gnawed at me more than the cold. That afternoon, I wandered through the flea market. It was crowded and noisy, with rows of stalls selling old books, chipped china, and clothes from another decade. At one table, I found a tarnished silver compact. It was scratched and worn, but when I opened it, the mirror inside was still clear. I bought it for the equivalent of $3, thinking of it as a small reminder even a scratched surface can still reflect. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and took photos of the peeling paint, the cracked tiles in the bathroom, the frayed curtains. Then I photographed the compact on the bedside table, its dull silver catching the dim light. I wasn't just collecting proof anymore. I was telling a story piece by piece, and each image was a chapter. That night, Daniel called instead of texting. "Hey, Mom, Claire and I are going to be late tomorrow. Don't wait up for breakfast. All right, I said. There was a pause. You're okay, right? I'm fine, I replied, keeping my tone even. Enjoy your day. He hesitated, then said goodnight. When the call ended, I sat there in the quiet holding the phone. I knew Daniel wasn't blind. He saw the distance Claire was creating. But seeing and acting were two different things. If I wanted to change this, I couldn't wait for him to speak up. I would have to find my own way to tip the balance. And tomorrow, with Richard's idea, I suspected that moment might come sooner than I thought. The morning unfolded in the usual rhythm rain, whispering against the window the muted hum of Marta in the hallway, but there was something different in the air. For once, my day wasn't dependent on Daniel or Claire. I had an appointment of my own. Richard's text had come early. Meet me at La Belle Terrasse, 12:30. Dress comfortably, you'll see why. La Belle Terrasse turned out to be a small, elegantly understated cafe tucked away on a side street near the theater district. The front windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee greeted me as I stepped in. Richard was already at a corner table waving as soon as he saw me. He looked as though he'd stepped straight out of a travel magazine tailored jacket scarf draped casually around his neck. Eleanor, he said warmly, standing to pull out my chair. I'm so glad you came. I smiled, unbuttoning my coat. It's nice to be somewhere. Well, nice. His eyes narrowed slightly as though he'd caught the weight behind my words. I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, he said after we ordered, and I don't like the picture it paints. I shrugged, trying to play it down. It's their trip, really. I'm just along for the ride. Come on, Eleanor. You're not a piece of luggage. He leaned forward. Let me guess you're paying your own way. Yes, I admitted. Of course. He shook his head. Then you deserve more than moldy walls and exclusion. The food arrived, a plate of grilled chicken salad for me, a crusty sandwich for him, and as we ate, he laid out his plan. I have a contact at a boutique hotel, Casa Lucia, he said. It's in the historic district, walking distance to almost everything. They owe me a favor, and I'd like to call it in for you. I frowned. Richard, I can't let you pay for that. You wouldn't be paying me back in money, he said with a smile. You'd be paying me back in good company. Let me host you for a few days, Eleanor. Just to give you the experience you should have been given in the first place. The thought of stepping out of that damp, suffocating room and into a place where I'd be treated like a guest, not a burden, was intoxicating. But more than that, it was the knowledge that I'd be doing it without Claire's involvement, without her permission. I'll think about it, I said slowly, but we both knew my answer. After lunch, Richard took me on a walking tour of the district. He showed me the hidden courtyards behind unmarked gates, the little artisan shops that didn't appear on any tourist maps, the bakeries where the locals queued for their favorite pastries. For the first time since arriving in the city, I felt like I was actually in it, not peering through a glass wall at other people's experiences. When I returned to my room that evening, Marta was in the kitchen pulling a loaf of bread from the oven. The smell wrapped around me like a blanket. You look different, she said, slicing into the loaf. I had a good day, I told her. She nodded knowingly and handed me 2 thick slices, still warm. Good days are like bread. They taste better when shared. I took the bread back to my room, sat on the bed, and ate slowly. I thought about Richard's offer. I thought about the way Claire's eyes might narrow when she realized I'd been somewhere she hadn't arranged, somewhere better than she'd allowed. I also thought about Daniel. If I moved to Casa Lucia, would he come see me? Would he notice the difference? Or had he already convinced himself that keeping the peace with Claire mattered more than standing up for me? That night, I made my decision. I called Richard and said, "Book it, I'll move tomorrow." There was a pause, then a satisfied, "Excellent." Before going to sleep, I packed my small suitcase, folding each item neatly, tucking away the compact I'd bought at the flea market, the one that still reflected clearly despite its worn surface. Tomorrow, I would be somewhere warm, clean, and dignified. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start turning this trip into the story I wanted to tell, not the one Claire had scripted for me. I left before breakfast the next morning. Not because I wanted to avoid Daniel and Claire, though that was a welcome side effect, but because Richard had arranged for a car from Casa Lucia to pick me up at 7:30. Marta helped me carry my suitcase down the narrow stairs. "This is good," she whispered. "You deserve better." The driver was waiting at the curb, a tall man in a dark coat who greeted me with a polite, "Mrs. Eleanor Wright, this way." The moment I stepped into the car, the smell of fresh leather and the warmth of the heater wrapped around me. We pulled away from the damp, crumbling building, the streets still glistening from an early rain. I glanced back once, catching sight of Marta at the doorway, her hand raised in a quiet wave. Casa Lucia appeared like something from a dream. A pale stone facade, ivy climbing up its walls, windows glowing with golden light. Inside, the air was scented with lavender and fresh coffee. The receptionist greeted me by name and offered me a warm towel for my hands. "Your suite is ready," she said. "Mr. Bennett insisted we give you one with a balcony." A bellman led me upstairs to a room that was everything my previous lodging wasn't: soft carpets, underfoot sunlight streaming through tall French windows, a bed with crisp white linens and plump pillows. The bathroom gleamed, the marble counter spotless, the air carrying the faintest scent of eucalyptus from the soaps. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, just breathing. For the first time since arriving in this city, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Richard arrived a half hour later carrying a small bouquet of fresh flowers. "For your balcony," he said with a grin. "Richard, this is beyond anything I expected." He waved off my gratitude. "It's what you deserve, Eleanor. Now promise me you won't waste your time hiding in here. I've arranged a few things, you'll love them." That afternoon, we went to a small gallery exhibition followed by lunch at a sunlit cafe. We talked about art, travel, the absurdity of hotel pricing, everything except Claire and Daniel. But in the back of my mind, I wondered when they'd notice. The answer came that evening. At 6:15, my phone rang. Daniel's voice was uncertain. "Mom, where are you? We went by your place and Marta said you'd moved." "I did," I said simply. "I'm staying at Casa Lucia now. It's closer to the places I want to see." There was a pause. "You didn't tell us." "I didn't think it mattered," I replied. "You've both been busy with your own plans." He didn't know what to say. I could almost hear him glancing toward Claire, waiting for her to signal a response. Finally, he said, "Well, I guess we'll see you tomorrow." Maybe I said, my tone neutral, "If our schedules match." After we hung up, I set my phone down and went to the balcony. The city stretched out before me, rooftops bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. I sipped the glass of wine the hotel had sent up as a welcome gift, and thought about how quickly control can shift when you simply stop playing by someone else's rules. The next morning, I went down for breakfast, not a silent, awkward buffet, but a small, sunlit dining room where each guest was served at their table. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, a pot of strong coffee, a dish of ripe berries. Halfway through my meal, I heard a voice behind me. "Well, this is cozy." I turned to see Claire standing there, a polite smile plastered on her face, Daniel lingering behind her. "Good morning," I said calmly, gesturing to the empty seat across from me. "Would you like to join me?" Her eyes flicked over the table, the white linen, the silver cutlery, and for the briefest second I saw it, the tightening around her mouth, the way her fingers curled slightly at her side. "No, thank you," she said sweetly. "We're headed to brunch at the hotel." I nodded, unbothered. "Enjoy." They left without another word. But I knew something had shifted. She'd seen that I could step outside her control, that I could have comfort, beauty, and dignity without her approval. And she didn't like it. That afternoon, Richard and I visited the Opera House for a behind-the-scenes tour. In the grand rehearsal hall with sunlight pouring through the high windows, I realized something. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about reclaiming my place in the story. I wasn't the unwanted extra in their vacation narrative anymore. I was writing my own version, and soon everyone would know it. The change in Claire was immediate. She still wore her polite smile when we crossed paths, but her tone had sharpened a blade hidden under silk. The morning after our encounter at Casa Lucia, she called. "Daniel and I thought we could all go to the old market today," she said. "It's very rustic. I'm sure you'd appreciate it." The way she said rustic made me picture cracked sidewalks and damp alleyways. "Thank you, but I already have plans," I replied. A pause. "Oh, with whom?" "A friend," I said, simply. I could almost hear her teeth grinding through the line. That friend, of course, was Richard. He'd offered to take me to a small countryside vineyard where the owners still bottled wine by hand. We spent the day strolling among the vines, sampling cheeses, and listening to the owner tell stories of his grandfather's harvests. It was the kind of quiet, rich experience you couldn't find in any travel brochure. When I returned to the hotel that evening, a folded note was waiting for me at the front desk. The paper was thick and expensive, the handwriting neat but tight. "Dear Eleanor, I worry you might be overextending yourself. Traveling can be tiring at your age. If you need help covering costs, please don't hesitate to ask. Warmly, Claire." I stared at it for a long moment. The message wasn't concern, it was a calculated insult. She wanted me to feel small, dependent like a burden. Instead, I slipped the note into the folder I'd started keeping in my suitcase, the same one that held photos of my old room, screenshots of her messages, and now this little gem of condescension. Richard noticed my distraction at dinner that night. "She's poking you," he said after I showed him the note, "testing how much she can get away with before you react." "She won't get the reaction she wants," I said. "Not yet." Over the next few days, her efforts became more obvious. She'd text Daniel with last-minute changes to the family itinerary, conveniently forgetting to include me, or she'd post photos on social media with captions like, "Just the two of us enjoying our trip," as though I weren't even there. The irony was, her little games freed me even more. While they were busy posing in front of hotel pools and trendy restaurants, I explored the city's back streets, visited tiny museums, and shared long conversations with Marta when I stopped by to bring her fresh pastries from the bakery near my new hotel. And the more she tried to erase me, the more I documented. I had photos of their hotel's online listing next to the damp images of my original room. I had dated receipts from the boutique hotel proving I'd paid nothing for my stay thanks to Richard's gift. I even had a short video of Marta describing how Claire had insisted I wanted the cheaper place. But the turning point came on the third night after I'd moved. I'd gone to a small evening concert at a chapel near the river. The music's soft strings under candlelight left me feeling both peaceful and powerful, as if I were gathering strength, note by note. When I returned to Casa Lucia, the receptionist handed me another envelope. This one bore Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a single line, "Mom, we need to talk. Alone." We met the next morning in a quiet cafe away from both hotels. He looked tired, lines of confusion etching his forehead. "Claire says you moved because you were embarrassed about the cost," he began carefully. I met his eyes. "Daniel, look at me. Does that sound like the truth?" He hesitated. "I don't know. She made it sound like you insisted on being separate, that you didn't want to spend time with us." I pulled the note from Claire across the table. "Read this. Then tell me she's been honest with you." He scanned it, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't sound like concern." "No," I said quietly. "It's control. And you've let her have it." He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "I didn't. I thought keeping the peace was better." Peace built on someone else's humiliation isn't peace, Daniel, I said. It's surrender. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. Doubt in the neat version of events Claire had been feeding him. When we parted, he hugged me tightly. I'll think about what you've said, he murmured. I left knowing the crack in her story had widened. Back at Casa Lucia, I stood on the balcony, the city's rooftops stretching into the horizon. The game was shifting, and I wasn't just a passive piece anymore. Claire had underestimated me, and soon she'd see exactly what that mistake would cost her. The morning after my conversation with Daniel, I woke up with a new kind of energy, not the raw nervous current I'd felt in those first days of humiliation, but a steady, deliberate hum. I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone enduring this trip, and started thinking of myself as someone shaping its outcome. And shaping it meant moving carefully. I began by placing small truths in places where they couldn't be ignored. Over breakfast at Casa Lucia, I chatted with the owner about the charming landlady I'd met in my first accommodation, never describing it in detail, but letting him hear the slight irony in my voice. Later that day, while in a small gift shop, I made sure to greet two women from our flight, who remembered seeing me at the airport with Daniel and Claire. They asked if I was enjoying my 5-star hotel. "Oh, I'm not there," I said lightly. "I was given something a little different." They leaned closer. "Different," I smiled. "Let's just say it had character." People remember comments like that, the sort you leave hanging in the air, ripe for curiosity to grow around. Claire, meanwhile, must have felt the shift, because her tone in texts became oddly chipper, as though a performance had begun. She started tagging me in social media posts, but always in ways that kept me peripheral. "Lovely lunch today. Mom joined us for dessert." Or, "Evening stroll." Mom took this photo. It was her attempt to look inclusive without actually changing her behavior. What she didn't realize was that she was providing me with time-stamped public evidence that I was excluded from the main events. Richard became my quiet accomplice. He'd suggest places we could go that were both stunning and unmistakably better than whatever Claire posted. A riverside bistro where the chef greeted us like old friends, a private viewing of a historic library, even a gondola ride through the old quarters waterways. I took discreet photos, not posed, not bragging, but natural, warm, and brimming with life. And when I shared them online, I used no captions at all. Just the images. Let people draw their own comparisons. The real breakthrough came at the weekly expat gathering Richard attended. It was a lively group filled with people who'd lived in the city for years. As we sipped wine under strings of garden lights, someone asked about my trip. I gave the polite version, then Marta's name came up. A woman at the table frowned. "Marta. She rents those small rooms near the tram station, doesn't she?" "Yes," I said. "She was kind enough to make my stay bearable when I was first placed there." Placed, another asked. The conversation rolled on, others chiming in about how unsuitable those rooms were for visitors, especially elderly travelers. I didn't need to say much, my initial phrasing had done the work. 2 days later, Daniel called again. His voice had a new edge. "Mom, people keep asking me why you weren't staying with us. Why would they even care?" "Maybe they care because it doesn't make sense," I said softly. "A family on holiday together? Yet the mother is sent to the other side of the city. You'd ask questions too, wouldn't you?" He didn't reply, but I could hear the cogs turning. Claire, however, wasn't going to let that crack widen without a fight. The next afternoon, she invited me to join them for dinner at their hotel. I agreed, not because I wanted to sit at her table, but because I wanted to see the territory she'd claimed as her own. The hotel was as grand as I'd imagined, marble floors, chandeliers, an atrium that smelled faintly of jasmine. The dining room was all gold accents and hushed conversation. But when the host led me to the table, I noticed two things immediately. Daniel and Claire had already ordered drinks, and my seat was placed slightly apart as though I were an afterthought. Claire launched into a story about their spa day peppered with little asides about how mom must be too busy with her friend to join them. I smiled, letting her think she was winning. Then halfway through the meal, I took out my phone. "I should show you where Richard took me yesterday," I said, sliding the screen toward Daniel. The photo was of the historic library, sunlight spilling through stained glass windows, me seated in a carved oak chair with a book in my hands. It wasn't ostentatious, but it radiated quiet luxury. Daniel's eyes flicked to Claire. "You didn't tell me Mom was seeing places like this?" Claire's smile was brittle. "Oh, well, I assumed she was keeping things simple." I didn't respond. Silence, I've learned, is more powerful than any retort. By the time dessert arrived, the dynamic at the table had shifted. Daniel's questions were more pointed, his glances toward me longer. Claire's attempts at control were becoming less effective, and she knew it. That night, back in my suite at Casa Lucia, I laid out the pieces I'd gathered. Photos of my original room and Marta's remarks. Claire's note dripping with false concern. Social media posts proving exclusion. Witnesses from both the expat group and our flight. I didn't know yet exactly how I'd use them, but I knew this: I wouldn't be taking them home in silence. This trip had begun as their stage. By the time it ended, it would be mine. I should have known Claire wouldn't back down easily. When a person thrives on control, the moment they feel it slipping, they don't retreat. They double down. It happened on what was meant to be our family day, something Daniel had arranged himself almost like a peace offering. He'd booked a table for 3 at a rooftop restaurant with panoramic views of the city, and for once, Claire hadn't been the one making the plans. That morning, I arrived at the meeting point early. The air was crisp, the streets alive with the soft hum of weekend markets. Daniel came a few minutes later, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him all trip. But Claire, she swept in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and an announcement. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. The reservation is for 2. I blinked. 2. "Yes," she said lightly. "It's a romantic lunch for Daniel and me. I thought you wouldn't mind. I arranged for you to have lunch downstairs instead. Much more casual." She gestured toward the cafe at street-level plastic chairs, crowded tables, the faint smell of fried oil wafting from the kitchen. Daniel looked stricken. "Claire, it's fine," I said, before he could speak. My voice was calm, even pleasant. "You two enjoy yourselves. I'm sure I'll find something to do." Inside, though, my composure was trembling like a taut wire. It wasn't just about the lunch. It was the public nature of it making the separation visible, deliberate. She wanted witnesses to my exclusion to etch it into the memory of anyone watching. I didn't sit at the cafe. Instead, I walked. I let the streets absorb my anger, my steps clicking against cobblestone as I thought of every time I'd been told to understand or be patient. Patience had been my prison for too long. When I finally stopped, it was in front of the old post office, a beautiful building with arched windows and brass fixtures. Inside, I bought thick envelopes and postage stamps. Back at Casa Lucia, I printed copies of every photo, every screenshot, every piece of written proof I'd collected. I wrote a short note to accompany each packet to whom it may concern. This is a record of how I was treated by my family during what was meant to be a shared trip abroad. I believe it speaks for itself. Some went to relatives back home who had always believed Claire's polished stories. Others were addressed to friends, the kind who never forgot a piece of gossip. A few, just a few, I kept in reserve for the right moment. That evening, when Daniel returned, I was sitting on the balcony. He didn't say anything at first, just poured himself a drink and stared out over the rooftops. "She told me you insisted you didn't want to come upstairs," he said finally. "Of course she did," I murmured. He turned to me. "Mom, I'm starting to think I've been blind." "Not blind," I said. "Just comfortable with the version of events she gave you. It's easier to believe in a peace that costs you nothing." He flinched not because my words were cruel, but because they were true. We talked for a long time that night. I didn't show him the full file yet. I wanted him to reach his own conclusion. But I did mention Marta, the room, the note. His jaw tightened more with each detail. The next day, I saw Claire's last attempt to reassert dominance. She accidentally posted a photo on social media, her and Daniel in their sweet champagne glasses raised with the caption, "Some people just can't keep up with our pace." I didn't comment. I didn't need to. People had already started to notice the contrast between her glossy images and my quiet, understated ones. The questions had begun without me lifting a finger, and that was the moment I knew the timing was right. I called Richard. "I need your help," I told him. "One last piece to complete the picture." He listened, then laughed softly. "Oh, Eleanor, I think you're about to give her a vacation she'll never forget." The plan we formed wasn't loud or messy. It was precise, like the final stitch on a tapestry that had been in the making all trip. It would require patience, restraint, and the right setting somewhere public enough that the truth couldn't be quietly swept away. That setting, as it turned out, would be the airport on our departure day. 3 more days. That was all I needed. 3 days to let the tension build, to let Claire think she'd escaped real consequence. She had no idea that every polite smile I gave her was simply me tying the final knots in a net she wouldn't see until it closed around her. By the time we landed back home, there would be no her version or my version. There would only be the truth laid bare for everyone to see, and I would be the one holding it. The 3 days leading to our departure stretched out like a taut rope, humming with unspoken tension. Claire moved through them with a brittle brightness, as though determined to prove to herself, to Daniel, to anyone watching, that she was still in command. I let her think she was. Sometimes victory comes not from forcing the shift, but from letting your opponent walk themselves right into it. On the morning of the first day, I was sipping coffee at Casa Lucia when my phone buzzed. It was Richard. "I've just had a thought," he said. "One of my friends, James, is hosting an afternoon tea at the embassy. It's a bit of a to-do, but the view from the terrace is extraordinary. You'd like it." Would Claire and Daniel be welcome? I asked, curious. A pause. "It's invitation only, but I think you'd enjoy yourself without them." There was no malice in his voice, just a subtle recognition of balance, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. I said yes. The embassy was everything Claire's hotel wasn't. Not just luxury, but history. Every wall told a story, every painting had been chosen with care. I found myself mingling with diplomats, writers, and musicians. No one asked me where I was staying, what I was doing for the rest of the trip, or any of the small cutting questions I'd endured earlier in the week. Instead, they asked about my work before retirement, my travels, my thoughts on the city's art scene. For hours, I wasn't someone's mother or mother-in-law. I was Eleanor Hayes, a woman with her own presence, her own place in the room. And oh, the terrace. Richard hadn't exaggerated. From there, the city spread out in golden layers, the river winding through like a ribbon. I took a photo, just one, the sunlight falling over my shoulder, the skyline blazing behind me. That evening, I posted it online. No caption. Within an hour, there were comments from friends back home. "Looks amazing. That view, where are you?" Claire saw it, of course. She liked it, a small, brittle click, but didn't comment. The next day, Daniel mentioned it casually. "Saw your picture, Mom. That was at the embassy." "Yes. Richard invited me. It was lovely." Claire's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "We didn't know you had embassy connections." "I didn't either until I made a friend who did," I said lightly. It wasn't lost on Daniel that his mother, the woman Claire had tried to sideline into obscurity, had been welcomed somewhere Claire couldn't buy her way into. The second day, Richard and I toured a private estate that belonged to a retired art dealer. We walked through gardens arranged like living paintings, dined in a sunlit conservatory, and shared stories with guests who treated me like an equal. Another photo, another post, another ripple Claire couldn't control. That evening, she tried a new tactic over compensation. She invited me to join them for a family dinner at their hotel's fine dining restaurant, complete with a dramatic reading of the menu and commentary on the wine list. But the conversation felt forced, her compliments too pointed, as though each one was meant to be witnessed by Daniel. I smiled, thanked her for including me, and offered no mention of my afternoon. Let her imagine it. The third day was the crown jewel. Richard had arranged something that even I couldn't have dreamed up, a private viewing of an upcoming art exhibit not yet open to the public. The curator walked us through each room, explaining the pieces, the hidden details, the artist's story. When we stepped into the final gallery, I stood in front of a massive painting light breaking through storm clouds over a dark sea and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd let shrink for too long. I took no photos this time. Some moments are too rich for cameras. But I did take the curator's card. Connections, after all, have a way of building on themselves. That night, as I packed for our flight home, I laid out the envelope I'd prepared for the airport. Inside were printed photos, screenshots, and a concise written account of everything that had happened on the trip. The packet wasn't for Daniel alone. There would be more than one copy. The plan was simple: present it in a public enough setting that it couldn't be dismissed or quietly forgotten. Claire thought the trip was ending. I knew it was only reaching its turning point. When I zipped my suitcase shut, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was calm, almost serene. The kind of calm that comes when you know the scales are about to tip, and for once, they'll land in your favor. Tomorrow, in the bright, echoing halls of the airport, the truth would come out, and there would be no taking it back. Airports have their own kind of electricity, a hum of movement, of beginnings and endings, of people trying to keep their emotions in check under fluorescent lights. I knew that energy would work in my favor. Claire clearly thought so too, though for different reasons. She arrived at the terminal dressed like she was walking into a fashion magazine spread, tailored white coat, oversized sunglasses, heels that clicked across the polished floor. Daniel trailed behind her, pulling their matching luggage set. I followed a few paces back with my modest suitcase, the same one I'd used for years. We exchanged the obligatory small talk at check-in. She was polite, almost overly so, as though she believed the trip's discomforts had been neatly tucked away in the bottom of my bag, never to be unpacked again. She didn't know that I'd saved the heaviest item for carry-on. The first crack came in the security line. A woman I vaguely recognized from one of Claire's extended family events approached me, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Eleanor. Oh, I saw your embassy photo, it looked incredible. How did you get an invite?" Claire's head swiveled toward us like a cat hearing the can opener. She forced a laugh. "Oh, that was just a little side thing she did. We were all busy that day, weren't we?" "We," the woman said, eyebrows raised. I smiled and didn't correct her. Some truths didn't need my help to take root. Once we'd passed through security, I suggested we sit in the central waiting area instead of the gate lounge. "Better light," I said. That was true, but it was also busier. Busier meant more ears. Daniel looked at me curiously when I pulled an envelope from my bag and placed it on the table between us. "What's this? Something you both should see before we go home." Claire's hand shot out, but I slid it toward Daniel. "It's for you." He opened it slowly, pulling out the neat stack of printed photos first, the stained ceiling in my rented room, the broken heater, the single thin blanket on the bed. The screenshots followed messages from Claire to relatives painting me as eccentric and too frugal to enjoy the hotel, claiming I'd insisted on staying elsewhere to save the family money. Daniel's face shifted with each page, confusion, disbelief, then something heavier. "Mom, you kept all this." "I documented what happened," I said quietly, because I knew that without proof it would just be my word against hers. Claire gave a tight laugh. Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. Are we really doing this here? Yes, I said. Here. Where there are witnesses. Where you can't rewrite the story before he hears it from me. She leaned back, crossing her arms. You're making drama out of nothing. It was a simple accommodation mix-up. Marta, I cut in, is the landlady of that rundown room. She told me you insisted I stay there even when she offered you a nicer space in the main house. She also said you paid her in cash to avoid leaving a record. Daniel's eyes snapped to Claire. Is that true? She sputtered. Daniel, you know how your mother can be. She likes her independence. I held his gaze. Independence is not the same as isolation. Silence settled between us, thick enough to muffle the announcements overhead. Around us, travelers pretended not to listen, but I could see a few leaning just slightly closer. Daniel pushed the envelope back toward Claire. Why, he asked. Not angrily, but with that quiet, dangerous edge that comes when a person realizes they've been played. Her veneer cracked. Because she said, her voice low, I wanted a vacation without babysitting. Is that such a crime? The words landed like a slap. Daniel's jaw tightened. She's my mother. She raised me. And you shoved her into a moldy room like she was a burden. I finished for him. Claire stood abruptly. I'm not having this conversation here. But she already had. And she knew it. She walked away toward the shop's heels, striking like gunshots. Daniel didn't follow. He sat there with me until boarding, silent except for one thing. I'm sorry, Mom. I should have asked more questions. I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. The point was that he'd finally seen it, not in whispered warnings but in undeniable documented fact. On the plane, Claire took the window seat and turned her face to the glass. Daniel sat between us, a buffer of silence. I rested my head back, not sleeping, but letting the hum of the engine smooth over the sharp edges of the moment. The fight wasn't over. These things rarely end in a single scene, but the balance had shifted. And once it shifts, it rarely shifts back. Coming home from a trip is supposed to feel like stepping into warmth, the familiar creak of your own floorboards, the quiet safety of your own bed. Instead, my return felt like sliding back into a chess match I hadn't agreed to play. Daniel carried my suitcase into the hallway, set it down with care, and stood there for a moment as though he might say something. Claire didn't linger. She was already halfway to the car, her white coat catching the wind. She didn't look back. She didn't even bother with the fake sweetness she'd worn at the airport. The car door shut, not slammed, but with that muted finality of someone making it clear they were done. Daniel turned to me. I'll call you tomorrow, Mom. His voice was low, guarded. His hand landed briefly on my shoulder before he followed her. The quiet they left behind was heavy. Not peaceful heavy. By the next morning, I realized the silence wasn't just in my house. It was in the air around me, carried on whispers. Airports are strange places. You think strangers don't notice you, but they do. And strangers talk. The scene at the airport must have traveled fast because I hadn't spoken to anyone about it yet. My phone began ringing. The first was Marlene, my sister-in-law. Her voice came through sharp, half with concern and half with the thrill of fresh gossip. Eleanor, what on earth happened? I've had 3 different people tell me you were put up in some kind of dump, while Claire and Daniel stayed in a 5-star hotel. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I gave her exactly what happened. Yes. Claire arranged it. Broken heater. Damp walls. 1 thin blanket. She told family I insisted so we could save money. I didn't. I have photos. Marlene gasped. My God. You do realize this is going to be the talk of the family for months, right? I'm aware, I said. And then, with more steadiness than I felt. And I'm fine with that. Because people like Claire survive on shadows, on keeping certain stories in the dark. The moment you drag the truth into light, they start scrambling. Over the next few days, my phone became a revolving door of calls and messages. Some were short and furious in my defense. Others were quiet and probing, looking for details without wanting to get their hands dirty. A few hinted they'd seen shades of this behavior from Claire before, just never so boldly. I didn't launch into speeches. I didn't lace my words with venom. I simply confirmed facts. And the more I repeated those facts, the heavier they seemed to land. 3 days after we got back, Daniel showed up at my door alone. No Claire trailing behind him, no quick excuse about having to leave soon. He lingered in the entryway, hands deep in his coat pockets. "I've been talking to people," he said slowly. "Family, friends. And I keep hearing things, small things that I should have noticed before. About Claire, about how she handles situations." I studied his face. "And what do you make of those things?" He hesitated, then sat down at my kitchen table like a man preparing for bad news. "I don't know yet. But I do know I can't just ignore this. I'm not going to let her treat you like that again." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest he'd come to taking my side in years. And for a moment I let myself breathe in that small shift. But I also knew Claire. And I knew silence from her wasn't surrender. Silence from her was planning. Sure enough, by the weekend, Marlene called again. "She's telling people you're overreacting, that you just weren't used to modern travel arrangements." I almost laughed. Modern arrangements. That was her new story. A neat little phrase to wrap her cruelty in ribbon, instead of confronting her directly, which would only give her the scene she'd twist into another story. I decided to build my position. I sat down at my computer and wrote a short, calm email to several family members. I attached the photos, the screenshots, and a brief explanation of the truth. I ended it simply. "I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to be clear on what actually happened. This is my account, and I stand by it." That was my line in the sand. Responses came in within hours. Most were supportive, some downright outraged. A few were cautious, tiptoeing around as though afraid to get involved. I didn't need them all on my side. I just needed the truth to be undeniable. A few days later, Daniel invited me to lunch. We chose a little Italian place we used to frequent before his marriage. He didn't bring Claire. "I've been thinking about next year," he said, pushing his plate toward me like he used to when he was a boy and wanted me to taste something. "We've talked about another trip, but I think maybe it should just be you and me. No one else. Keep it simple." It was such a small sentence, yet I felt something inside me loosen. "I'd like that," I said softly. We talked about neutral things after that, work, neighbors, old family recipes. But under it all was something new, the first real sign that Daniel had started to see Claire without the rose-colored glass she'd always demanded he wear. When we said goodbye, I didn't kid myself. I knew this wasn't over. Claire wouldn't retreat quietly. She'd come back swinging, but now she'd be facing a son who had questions she couldn't answer without exposing herself. And questions once planted have a way of growing roots. For the first time since stepping into that damp little room abroad, I felt a shift in the balance. I was no longer on the defensive. I wasn't just surviving her moves, I was starting to make my own. And I was nowhere near finished. Family gatherings are supposed to be warm, comforting, predictable. But the one at my brother's house that Sunday felt like stepping into a theater where every smile might be part of someone else's script. The kitchen smelled of roast chicken and baked bread, but the air was thick with something far less inviting, the quiet hum of curiosity. People weren't just here to eat. They were here to see, to measure my expression, to catch a glimpse of the tension they'd heard about through the grapevine. I walked in with a plate of lemon bars, the same recipe my mother used to make. I could feel eyes following me as I crossed the room. My niece Lila came up for a hug. "Aunt Eleanor," she whispered, "is it true?" She trailed off, unsure how much she was allowed to say. I didn't answer her directly. "It's true that I'm glad to see you," I said, kissing her forehead before moving toward the dining table. Claire was already there, sitting beside Daniel, her posture perfect. She wore a soft cream sweater and that controlled smile she saved for public appearances. She didn't look at me when I arrived, which told me one thing: she was nervous. Claire only ignored people when she was calculating her next move. We made it through the first course without incident, small talk, whether a few safe stories about vacations past. Then Marlene, bless her meddling heart, decided to light the match. So she said brightly, her fork poised midair, "Eleanor, how is your accommodations abroad?" The room quieted just enough for me to feel the shift. Claire's smile faltered for half a second before returning polished as ever. I set my fork down gently. "They were educational," I said, meeting Marlene's eyes. "I've never quite appreciated central heating and clean bedding so much." Someone chuckled under their breath. Claire spoke before the silence could deepen. "Eleanor insisted on staying somewhere small and local. She said she wanted to experience authenticity. We thought it was a little unconventional, but she seemed set on it. And there it was, the public version of her lie, delivered smoothly without a hint of guilt." I reached into my handbag. "That's an interesting recollection, Claire, because my memory of the conversation is a little different. And I have a few photos I think might help clear things up." I slid my phone across the table toward Marlene, who sat closest. She tapped the screen, and her face changed instantly from curiosity to shock. "Is this mold on the wall?" Marlene asked, holding the phone higher so others could see. "Yes," I said. "And those I pointed are the exposed wires above the sink." "Oh, and the one with the blanket, that was the only one I had. The heater didn't work." Murmurs rippled around the table. Claire laughed lightly, though it sounded brittle. "Well, I suppose the photos make it look worse than it was. It had character." "It had damp," I corrected softly. "And rust. And a lock on the inside that didn't work. And before you suggest again that it was my choice, I have the text you sent Daniel confirming you'd booked the cheap place for her to save on costs." Daniel froze. "Claire." But she cut him off. "Eleanor, this is hardly appropriate dinner conversation." "That's the thing," I said, my voice calm but carrying. "It became appropriate the moment you made it public. You told family I wanted it. You told people I chose it over the hotel." "That wasn't true. And I won't sit here while my name is tied to a story that paints me as petty or miserly." The room was silent now, all eyes swinging between us. Claire's hand tightened around her wineglass. Marlene broke the tension. "I think it's fair," she clarifies. "Claire, we've all been wondering." Claire's mask cracked just slightly. "Fine. If you want the truth, I was trying to manage our budget. It's expensive traveling with 3 people and yet," I said gently, "you managed to book a suite at a 5-star hotel for yourself and Daniel." Her mouth opened, then closed. There was no graceful escape from that sentence. Daniel looked from her to me, his brow furrowed. "Why didn't you just say that from the start?" Claire shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that isn't casual at all, the kind that says she's cornered. I didn't press further. The point had been made. The truth was out in front of everyone who mattered. Claire could spin her web all she wanted after tonight, but it would never be the same. Too many people had seen the strands unravel. The rest of dinner was subdued. People talked about other things, but the earlier exchange hung in the air like the scent of something burned. Claire barely touched her plate. When dessert came, Lila slid into the seat beside me. "I like that you told the truth," she said quietly, "even if it made things weird." I smiled. Sometimes making things weird is the only way to make them right. As we left, Daniel walked me to my car. "Mom," he began, his voice low. I didn't realize how bad it really was. "I'm sorry." I studied his face. "I know you didn't, Daniel, but now you do." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, now I do." I drove home with the streetlights sliding past like slow-moving stars. My hands were steady on the wheel. For the first time in weeks, the weight I'd been carrying felt lighter, not gone, but lighter. This wasn't the end. Claire would retreat, regroup, and try again. But the ground under her was weaker now. The people she counted on to believe her unquestioningly had heard another version, one backed by evidence. And in families like ours, once doubt is planted, it has a way of growing whether you water it or not. 3 days passed before Claire reached out. I wasn't surprised she needed time to patch up the cracks from Sunday's dinner before trying to face me again. People like Claire don't operate on impulse when they've been cornered. They wait until they can present themselves as calm, reasonable, and still in control. The call came in just after 7 p.m. Her name lit up my phone screen, the neat white letters looking far more harmless than the person they represented. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but then I thought, no, I want to hear the shape of her voice now. I want to hear how she sounds when the room isn't full of witnesses. Eleanor, she said when I answered, her tone warm, almost syrupy. I think we should talk. Just the two of us. It's important. I could almost see her rehearsed smile. All right, I said. Come by tomorrow, 10 a.m. When she arrived, she was dressed down, soft cardigan hair loosely tied back, makeup minimal. It was the kind of look designed to signal vulnerability. She stepped into my living room and placed a paper bag on the coffee table. From that bakery you like, she said. Thought we could share. I sat opposite her. Thank you. For a moment she was quiet, looking at her hands. Then she sighed as if summoning courage. Eleanor, I think things have gotten a little out of hand. I said nothing, letting the silence pull at her. I never wanted there to be tension between us, she went on. The trip, the room, I admit, maybe I made the wrong call. But it wasn't out of malice. I was trying to balance things to make it work for everyone. You know how expensive travel can be. Her eyes lifted to mine, gauging my reaction. I leaned back. Claire, if that's the truth, why did you tell people I chose it, that I preferred it? She hesitated, her voice dropping a note. Because I didn't want anyone thinking badly of you. Or of us. Families talk, and I thought, it would be better if they believed it was your decision. Better for whom? I almost said it aloud, but I knew the answer. This isn't really about a room anymore, I said. It's about trust. And trust is not something you rebuild with half apologies. Something flickered in her eyes, then the softness gone, the steel showing through. Eleanor, I know you have your version of events. And I know you've been sharing it, but we both understand how stories can shift depending on who's telling them. I'd hate for the family to start feeling divided over something that could have been handled quietly. There it was. The real reason for her visit. Not reconciliation, containment. I leaned forward, my voice calm but deliberate. Claire, division happens when people choose deceit over honesty. I didn't create that. You did. I simply refused to keep quiet about it. Her lips tightened. And where does that leave us? That I said depends entirely on your next choices, not mine. For the first time, she seemed unsure how to proceed. Claire was used to dealing with people who bent to keep the peace. She wasn't used to someone meeting her halfway, holding ground without raising their voice. She stood, smoothing her cardigan. I suppose we'll see, she said, her tone clipped now. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth. I do care about Daniel's relationship with you. I hope you'll keep that in mind. I do, I said. And that's exactly why I won't pretend this never happened. When she left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The kind of steadiness that comes when you stop negotiating with someone over the terms of your own dignity. That night, Daniel called. Mom. Did Claire come by? She did, I said. And she knows exactly where I stand. I made sure of it. He was quiet for a moment. I want to believe we can work this out, all of us. But I'm starting to think maybe some things can't be smoothed over. Some things shouldn't be. I replied. Not if the cost is pretending you weren't wronged. He exhaled slowly. I'll be over this weekend. We'll talk more then. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen looking out the window at the quiet street. I knew Claire wouldn't let this go. Not entirely. People like her don't back down. They shift strategies. But I also knew something else. The more she pushed now, the more obvious it would become to everyone else what I had already seen clearly. And in the end, that was all I needed to win. Not shouting matches, not dramatic ultimatums. Just the truth visible enough that no amount of her polishing could hide the cracks. By the time the weekend came, I was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant the final confrontation I had long suspected was inevitable. Daniel arrived early that Saturday morning, his car pulling up in front of my house before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. I watched him step out, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, head down, as though bracing for something. He didn't have to say a word for me to know today wasn't going to be simple. When he came inside, I already had coffee ready. He sat at the kitchen table, wrapping his hands around the mug as if drawing strength from the warmth. Claire told me about your talk, he said, finally eyes fixed on the steam rising from the coffee. She says you're holding on to this to punish her. I leaned back in my chair. Daniel, do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I want our relationship to be one long standoff? He didn't answer right away. No, he admitted. But I think she feels cornered. And when she feels cornered, she doubles down. You've seen it. I nodded. I've seen it. But I've also seen what happens when people like Claire aren't held accountable. They get bolder. Next time, it won't be a rundown room on a trip. It'll be something bigger. Something that can't be fixed with a conversation and a few photos. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. I just want peace. Peace without truth isn't peace, Daniel, I said softly. It's a performance, and I'm too old to keep acting in other people's plays. We sat in silence for a moment, the clock ticking quietly in the background. Then Daniel sighed. She wants to see you. Both of us together. One more time. I studied his expression. To talk to, find some middle ground, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I agreed, not because I thought Claire would suddenly transform into a person who valued honesty, but because I wanted her to say her piece, where Daniel could hear it without filters. No more, he said, she said. No more carefully curated versions of events. She arrived that afternoon. I met her at the door, and Daniel stayed close, as if ready to step in if the conversation tilted too far toward confrontation. Eleanor, she began, thank you for agreeing to this. I know we've both said things. I held up a hand. Claire, I'm not interested in trading apologies just for the sake of appearances. Say what you came to say. Her jaw tightened, but she pressed on. What happened on the trip was poorly handled. I admit that. But dragging it out, making it something the whole family talks about, that doesn't help anyone, especially Daniel. Daniel glanced at me, then back at her. Claire, you're saying that like Mom didn't have a right to speak up. She turned to him, her tone softening. I'm saying it could have been handled privately. Between us. That's rich, I said quietly, coming from someone who lied publicly. Her eyes narrowed. So you're just going to keep holding this over me forever? No, I said, my voice even. I'm going to hold on to the truth. If you want to move forward, you'll need to accept that the truth exists, not just your version of it. Something shifted in Daniel's face, then a subtle breaking of some internal loyalty. He looked at her differently, not angrily, but as though he was seeing her without the lens she'd always managed to place between herself and others. Claire, he said, this isn't just about Mom. It's about you thinking you can control the story no matter what actually happened. That's a problem. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She hadn't expected him to take my side so plainly. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. I'm willing to put this behind us, I said, but not if it means pretending it never happened. That's my line. If you can live with that, then we might still have a relationship worth salvaging. If not, then at least we'll all know where we stand. Claire looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, controlled. Fine. But her tone told me she wasn't conceding. She was retreating. And that was enough for me. The following weeks were quieter. Claire didn't reach out much, and when she did, it was through Daniel. There was no more talk of trips abroad, no more subtle digs in family conversations. I knew she was nursing her pride, waiting for a moment to reassert herself. But she also knew, and this was the victory I valued most, that I wasn't the kind of opponent she could silence or shame into submission. One Sunday afternoon, I was sitting in the garden when Daniel came by. He sat beside me, looking out at the hydrangeas I'd been coaxing back to bloom. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about that trip. About how easily I could have missed what really happened if you hadn't spoken up." I smiled faintly. That's how it goes sometimes. The truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes you have to insist on it. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you did." We didn't talk about Claire after that. Not directly. But I could tell his perspective had shifted. He was watching her more closely now, noticing the small manipulations that had once slipped by unnoticed. It wasn't my goal to turn him against his wife. It was my goal to make sure he understood that loyalty doesn't mean blindness, and that sometimes the people you think you're protecting by staying silent are the very ones who most need to hear you speak. Months later, I found myself in a different country again, this time by choice, and entirely on my own terms. I stayed in a modest but comfortable inn by the sea with fresh flowers in the room and the sound of waves through the open window. I walked cobblestone streets at my own pace, ate when and where I pleased, and never once felt like an afterthought. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on a balcony overlooking the water and thought about how far I'd come since that miserable, damp little room Claire had put me in. The hurt was still there in memory, but it no longer burned. It was just a marker, a point in time where I decided I would never again let someone else dictate the value of my presence. Because that's what it had been about all along, not money, not inconvenience, but value. Claire had placed hers above mine, assuming I'd accept the lesser share because I wouldn't want to make trouble. She'd been wrong. If you've ever been made to feel small, if someone has ever tried to convince you that you deserved less than they did because you wouldn't fight for more, I want you to hear me. You are allowed to fight. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be in the room in the hotel in the story fully and unapologetically. The cost of speaking up is often discomfort, but the cost of silence is so much greater. And I, for one, have paid enough. If you've lived through something similar, a trip, an event, a family moment where you were treated as if your worth was negotiable, tell your story. Someone else needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grace's Truth, join us. Here, your voice matters.